Okay, so today we're going to talk about socioeconomic disadvantage in health. And some of you guys might be really familiar with this concept. I think probably most of you are familiar with the fact that, having a low socioeconomic status or having that disadvantage leaves you more susceptible to poor health outcomes. So this first objective might be review for you. We're going to review the pathways through which socioeconomic disadvantage impacts individual health. We're also going to discuss the impact of income inequality on the health of a population. And that is something that I want you to pay particular attention to. And then in the third part of this lecture, we're going to discuss the public policies or the evidence-based interventions that we can use or implement to improve the health outcomes of people facing socioeconomic disadvantage, because it's not a mystery. There are programs that exist that we can just implement. So first, let's review why psychological stress is so stressful. So what are the factors that play a role in really triggering this stress response, even when it's just psychological stress? So no outlets for frustration, remember, a lack of predictability. And remember the example that even if there's no stressor, when you lose predictability, it still triggers a stress response. And the experiment that was mentioned for this example was the rat who was fed at timed intervals. And then all of a sudden the feeding schedule changed to random intervals, and they were still getting the same amount of food and it was still a reward. But even just that change and that lack of predictability triggered a stress response. The lack of control is the big one, and it's not even the lack of control, it's the lack of believing that we're in control, right? Because, and this is very relevant for like pain control or any other thing. If we think that we have a little bit of control over the situation, it really helps. And we just have to believe that to be true. So lack of social support, this is a huge one. And this is really one of the areas where income inequality plays a big role. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then the perception of worsening. So it's not necessarily like the absolute value, it's like your vector or your direction of where you're going, right? And we'll start by just discussing what socioeconomic status is, because this is among the strongest determinants of health and health disparities in the United States, largely because the access to resources is shaped by your access to education, your access to income, and your access to power. And this, a person's socioeconomic status is comprised of their economic, social, and work status in comparison to the larger community. And so that's where that rank comes into play. And your social status is like your power and rank in a group. So people in the highest income group can expect to live, on average, at least 6.5 years longer than people in the lowest income group. Even those in the middle, so families of four making between $41,000 to $83,000 a year in 2007 will die on average 2 years sooner than those at the top. Rates of illness for US adults in their 30s and 40s with low income and lower education are comparable to those of affluent adults in their 60s and 70s. So this is kind of part of that allostatic load or that wear and tear concept. You just tend to get an accumulation of damage, which leads to disease a lot earlier when you're facing socioeconomic disadvantage. So socioeconomic disadvantage is both your socioeconomic status, which was your education, your income, your rank, your occupation, right? But also your subjective perception of your social position. And then also the contextual indicators of disadvantage. So the contextual indicators meaning like, do you live in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty? So are you poor? Plus, you can look around you and see that your entire environment has a lot of hazards and is, reflective of a lower rank in society. And this subjective perception of social position is particularly important, and we'll come back to this often, because that makes a huge difference, because if everyone in a society is poor, then nobody is poor. There's no difference. So, so why does this lead to increased health, increased adverse health outcomes? One reason is because they have an increased risk of exposure to many kinds of environmental hazards. So when we think about like older buildings, there's lead that is involved, pollution because they might live near a highway, but then also an increased susceptibility because of the stress response being activated that has a direct impact on your cardiovascular health, right? So you might also be like susceptible to getting illnesses because of the blunting effect that it has on your immune system, which we'll get to later on in the semester. But then also a decreased capacity to cope because you don't have that buffering, those buffering factors, right? And so think of, I think of myself now in my position, if I get a flat tire or whatever, like it's fine because I can manage that. And there's a lot of other resources that I can call upon, that I can rely upon, that doesn't like ruin my day. If that in a different circumstance means that I lose my job, that, my kids can't eat, that whatever else it means, then like that's a decreased capacity to cope. But also just like psychological capacity to cope, because when you're already like so overburdened and weighed down by life's stressors, then it can be really hard to take on another one. And then a reduced capacity to recover. And this is again, largely because of the stress response. And so looking at this chart, socioeconomic disadvantages, and then a lifetime exposures over and over and over, you have these biological adaptations, remember, that become maladaptive. So you have the amygdala and the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex all getting wired in a certain way, right? And you learned that in the FOAD lectures. And then the physiologic pathways involving your sympathetic nervous system, involving your HPA axis, and making sure that these two are triggered very quickly and stay on for a long time. But then that has real effects on your metabolic processes and your metabolism, your hunger, right? Or what you eat, because when you're stressed, remember, you are usually craving a certain type of food and it's not vegetables. It also has an impact on your immune response and, the rate of inflammation within your body. And all of that plays a role in this allostatic load and the wear and tear. And so then, over time, you get an increase in morbidity, mortality. So all of this at this point should be familiar to you. And if it's not, then go ahead and go back to pause this, go back and review any of these that aren't familiar. So poverty, what is poverty? Because we talk about it all the time, right? It's actually insufficient resources to meet basic human needs. And so this has changed a little bit. It's a little bit outdated, but in 2012, poverty meant making about $1.90 a day. Okay, so there aren't probably a lot of people in poverty in the United States, and that's not actually what we're talking about when we're talking about the United States. So even though you hear about poverty all the time, if we're, taking a step back and looking at the whole world, like there's not a whole lot of people in poverty in the United States outside of a pandemic, right? But we still have our own measurements of poverty. And this is relative poverty, right? Because we're really comparing people from within the United States, but that is a totally different concept than actual absolute poverty. And we'll talk about that more later. And you can see that, the geographic distribution differs, right? Rural versus urban, southern versus northern. So poverty rates are different depending on where you live. And although it does have an impact on your ability to get health care, so uninsured adults are at least 25% more likely to die prematurely than adults who have private insurance. That is like a real risk factor. This is not the primary factor by which poverty plays a role. And if you look to see about if whenever we quiz people or like poll people on their perception of stress due to like uncertainty about paying medical bills, you can see that like households that make below $50,000 and households who make above $50,000, they kind of worry about these issues at the same rates. So while yes, access to healthcare is one significant risk factor, this is not why poverty in the United States plays a huge role in creating health inequities. We do have a pretty high childhood poverty rate, and remember that's going to play a huge role when we're talking about how that generation is like trained, how their stress response is trained and triggered, and their lifelong health. So looking at where we are way over here. So individuals exposed to socioeconomic disadvantage are more frequently sick. They die earlier. They have higher morbidity and mortality rates throughout adulthood. And this is, again, another just review of some of those biological mechanisms, but they should all make sense to you. So take a few minutes, go through the slides and go through this. So, you have a decrease in your hippocampus. Remember that shuts off your stress response. But if you are exposed to socioeconomic disadvantage in childhood, your hippocampus is going to be damaged, and some of those glucocorticoid receptors are going to be downregulated, right? And so then it's going to be harder to turn off that stress response. But then it's harder to learn and to pay attention because you also have the pathway between your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex not well pruned and not well connected. And so anything that could possibly stress you out, the door slamming, whatever, it's going to be really hard to calm down because you don't have that connection between your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala to tell it, hey, it's nothing, let's pay attention. And then you have the metabolic impacts, the inflammatory impacts, you still have that allostatic load concept going on. And this just like potentiates throughout life. And so here are some of the health outcomes that are related to socioeconomic disadvantage during childhood. So we have higher infant mortality, higher and negative birth outcomes. So prematurity, low birth weight. During childhood, you have poor language, cognitive deficits, behavioral problems, asthma, dental problems, physical inactivity. Adolescence, you have more substance abuse, more disruptive behaviors, depression. Adulthood, you have reduced work productivity, increased involvement in crime, mental illness, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all of the things that we really are trying to focus on and trying to decrease, all of the things that we know that there's huge inequities around. A lot of that has to do with socioeconomic disadvantage during childhood. Childhood poverty costs the US $500 billion annually. That is a lot. And that is largely due to the loss in potential earnings, involvement with the criminal justice system, and costs associated with poor health outcomes. So children living in poverty are about 7 times as likely to be in poor or fair health than children living in high income households. But even middle class children are 2 times as likely to be in poor or fair health than those at the top. And that is significant. That might just seem like, okay, well, it's like a linear correlation, right? But we're not talking about like mathematics and statistics. We're actually talking about like, well, why would middle class children be at increased risk of poor health outcomes when they have health insurance, they have access to what they need. They're not completely, stigmatized and at the bottom of the ladder. So it can't be the absolute value of the income, right? Their parents have jobs. It's not that. Some of them are like, better respected, if that's even an appropriate phrase to use for that. And so why would even middle-class children be suffering poor health outcomes when all of those basic needs are taken care of and they're not dealing with the same, degree of disadvantage that kids growing up in poverty are? So think about that for a minute. And if it doesn't come to you, if the answer doesn't come to you, we will get to it. So we also see racial inequities and poverty rates, right? And so we will also talk about, whenever we talk about the biology of bias, we'll talk about some of the issues behind the racial inequities. And yes, while some of it also has to do with socioeconomic disadvantage, that's not like all of it. So don't be convinced that this explains everything, but recognize that yes, there are inequities, and those inequities are growing, it looks like, right? So 2016 to 2017, the poverty rate rose for all infants, but it rose even higher than everyone else for Black infants. Occupation and health. So blue-collar workers have higher rates of disability, premature death, lower health-related quality of life than white-collar workers. Blue-collar workers are like mechanics and I don't know what else. And then white-collar workers are like business office people. Lower occupational status is associated with adverse psychological effects. It's also associated with unhealthy behaviors. And this is a key to just acknowledge, because sometimes whenever we're talking about socioeconomic disadvantage, people will point out, well, they, do like risky or unhealthy behaviors more often. That might be true to some extent, but that doesn't explain the inequities. And so even if they just changed all the behavior and everyone stopped smoking, everyone started eating like perfect, perfectly well-balanced nutritional diets, and everyone started exercising, it still wouldn't take away the health inequities due to socioeconomic disadvantage. Then think about it, because even middle class, relatively protected people still have worse outcomes than upper class. Blue collar workers are twice as likely to smoke, okay? In 2016 investigation, working adults in the US reported negative health impacts from their job. So 28% said their job negatively affects their eating habits. Makes sense, okay. 27% said that it negatively impacts their sleeping habits. And this is like really significant, actually, the sleeping part, especially if you work shift work and if you don't have control over a shift. So part of that is that control, but also that lack of predictability in your schedule. That's going to create a lot of stress. And then on top of that, not being able to sleep, even worse. For those in industry and construction, job burnout is associated with male infertility. Okay, so what does that have to do with anything? It could be an exposure to like toxins, and probably does have something to do with that, right? But also remember, when your stress response system is activated, your body kind of shuts down all the unneeded processes. So you don't need to ovulate or reproduce or anything like that, right? When you're about to die. And so if that is constantly turned on or triggered all the time, then it makes sense that it would be associated with some infertility. But even white collar workers also suffer from physical complaints and have increasing rates of obesity. In blue collar workers, overtime, whether it's mandatory overtime or voluntary overtime, both are associated with fatigue, sleep deprivation, and risk for work-related accidents. That's something that we can change, right? The lower American workers rank on the national economic ladder, the more likely their jobs will be physically demanding. So such jobs can lead to more stress, both physical and mental, and higher medical bills. And workers in physically demanding jobs also typically retire earlier before they can claim their full Social Security benefits. So think about that. Like the people who are at the bottom of the economic ladder probably are going to have some higher medical bills due to the physical wear and tear on their body. And I'm not just talking about their arteries, but like their back and injuries. So you've heard of this study before when you watched the stress video, but we'll talk about it a little bit more in detail. So in this study, Marmot's study, he studied civil servants in the UK, and they are like a very strict hierarchy or caste, right? But they all have universal health care. They're all relatively like homogenous population. And so this was a really good, observational experiment because there weren't a whole lot of variables. And so what they found is that a man's grade of employment was the strongest predictor of his subsequent risk of coronary heart disease and death by cardiovascular disease than any other major coronary risk factors. So men in the lowest grade, which were the messengers, had 3 to 6 times the rate of mortality of men in the highest grade, which were the administrators. Men in lower employment grades were shorter, heavier for their height, had higher blood pressure, higher plasma glucose, smoked more, and reported less leisure time physical activity than men in higher grades. But when an allowance was made for the influence on mortality of all those factors, so all of the behavioral factors, all of the like medical risk factors, all of the lack of activity, everything, still there was a relationship between employment and your occupational status, your hierarchy, on the hierarchy, and death or health outcomes. So all of those factors could only explain a small amount, and that is what this chart looks at. So the relative risk of coronary heart disease death in different grades is explained by risk factors. So cholesterol, that's this one, smoking a little bit, blood pressure a little bit more, others a little bit more, maybe exercise, whatever, family history, genetics. But then this, look in comparison, like it's really the social status, rank of your occupation, level of control, level of predictability, outlets for frustration, all of that, that make it the hugest impact on these health inequities. So I'll let you watch this in the module. Unemployment is a specific stressor on top of everything else. So this is kind of like on top of your occupational status, whatever else, because unemployment just puts a whole nother level of like stress on people. And this is really, really, significant, especially now in the last year, due to COVID. So we need to know how this is going to affect the health of our population. Looking at new unemployment claims, here was the last year, right? And a lot of this has to do with stress. And because, so here's another chart from like 1900. Here's where the US weekly initial jobless claims were. So getting closer, saw that during 2008. And then this is what's going on now. So this is going to have a huge impact on the health of our population, because being unemployed is like a special, level of stress, especially when your health insurance is tied to your employment. Education. Let's move on to education. So education can create opportunities for better health, right? Because it gives you income and resources and access to lots of things like social capital. But then poor health can also put your education at risk. So like having the lack of an education is a risk factor, but also having poor health is a risk factor that negatively impacts your education. And then there are contextual factors. So other conditions, social policies, family characteristics, right? Higher education equals higher income. And this is true on a global scale, particularly for global health, because for both, for women who are educated, like every year, that they go in education, it has profound positive benefits, both for the woman who gets the education, but also for her children and also for her community. And so higher education equals higher incomes. And this actually, comes in handy whenever I'm seeing patients who are adolescents who might not know if they want to go to college or not. One thing I want to point out is that the difference between a high school diploma, some college, and an associate degree is not that significantly different. And so you never want to stop with the associate's degree because it doesn't give you a whole lot of leverage. You always want to go for at least the 4-year degree or beyond. Literacy levels predict health. Okay, well, that makes sense, right? College graduates have more wealth than those without a college degree. Okay, that makes sense. Nothing surprising there. But then income predicts educational attainment. So let's take a couple of minutes to look at this graph. So a top scoring, so here is the high score is right here. Low score is in the blue, and this is compared to the income status. So, and what it's looking at is the college completion by income status and 8th grade test scores. So in 8th grade, people who have the highest score or the lowest scores in their 8th grade test, but who are in a high income bracket are more likely to complete college than people who have the highest scores on those 8th grade tests and are in the lowest income bracket. So while the relationship between education and income and health should not be a surprise to anyone, this should be. So lower socioeconomic status, lower educational attainment leads to limited access to higher status jobs, leads to limited earning potential, leads to limited access for furthering your education. And it's this vicious cycle that just goes around and around. So we'll stop there, and then I'll come back and talk about the next part of the topic, but really think about why, if it's not poverty that is driving all of these inequities, like what is it? Why might middle class be negatively affected, just like lower socioeconomic classes, even if they have all of the resources they need? And why would your income be a better predictor of your college outcomes or your college completion than your actual test scores?